Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first panel today of the Berlin Demography Days 2024. My name is Ronja Bachhofer, and I will be guiding you through this discussion today. First of all, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to write them in the Q&A at any time. You can find it at the bottom of the screen, and I will then try to bring them into the discussion. Yeah, I look forward to your participation in this discussion. I will switch to German in a minute. If you would like to listen in English translation, you can find the interpretation at the bottom of your screen as well. It is this little globe, I think it was. Yes, if you cannot find it, let me know. So, und dann würde ich jetzt auf Deutsch weitermachen.
And now I will continue in German. Ladies and gentlemen, let me repeat in German, a warm welcome to everybody on the second day of Berlin Demography Days 2024. My name is Ronja Backhofer, and I will chair this session today. You can leave your messages or comments in the Q&A session, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. We are going to talk about pandemics and access to information today. The COVID-19 pandemic, it seems it's a long time ago already. I have already dwelled into a different life, but at that time I was really longing for information. Where does the virus come from? How is it spread, and what are the rules to follow? Then we learned what is the R value, how can we do the quick test. We tried to understand statistics, and everyone had favorite virologists very soon. And on the other hand, however, there was a lot of misinformation. There was a lot of quarrel, division, protests in the streets, and uncertainties, because we as a society trusted different pieces of information. And now let's take a look how we communicated during the pandemic. Where did information come from? And of course, mainly we want to look ahead and consider how information can be communicated in a better way in the future. And as I'm not the only one to answer those questions, there are 4 experts which are live on air, and you can see them on the screen. And I would like to introduce them briefly to you now. Ms. Virginia Wangare Greiner, she's the chief executive and co-founder of the association Maisha in Frankfurt. This is a self-help organization of African women providing health advice for migrants from Africa and their family members. And she's also a member of the Integration Council of Hesse and president of the European Migrants Network. And she is struggling for equal rights for migrants and migrant families in Germany. That covers family law, but also health issues. Mr. Andreas Backhaus, he's a senior research fellow at the Federal Institute for Population Research. And during the COVID pandemic, he posted on X, which then was called Twitter, some plausibility ideas, and he already looked into the sources of those data, who they represent, and whether the statistic links which were found are really reflecting the root causes, or whether this was just fake. Ms. Doris Schaeffer, she's a professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences at Bielefeld University. In her work, she dealt a lot with health-related crises, for instance, with the increasing lack of expert staff, or also when searching for new healthcare models. And presently, she is dealing with the subject of health literacy, and she's having a lot of studies on that basis. Mr. Ihlen, he's a professor in the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo. He's sharing a research project funded by the Norwegian Research Council, and he is focusing on strategic communication on political subjects. For example, he was doing a lot of research about the Nordic countries, how they dealt with the pandemic and the policies, and how they communicated all that to the population. Well, that's the group of 4 experts for this panel. And I'm very happy that you joined us here. And that is enough for me to talk, because we want to have a very vivid discussion right now. And let me start by looking at the present situation. And maybe that's a question to Ms. Scheffler. You are dealing with health literacy, and I would like to know, what is the situation like in Germany about this? Thanks a lot for having me and also for your question. Please, at the beginning, let me say what we actually understand by the term of health literacy. And the easiest way to get hold of the subject is, well, that term comes from the US-American literacy debate, and it is the easiest way to become aware what is the English term, and in English it's called health literacy. So basically it's about um, being really knowledgeable in fields in the field of health, or to what extent people are really able to understand health issues, to what extent they are having the capabilities to read and write information about health. In the meantime, we have extended this understanding, and there are actually 4 subjects which we are researching, namely how to find health information. That seems to be an easy task, but it's not so easy as it seems. And it has to be understood as well. And it takes a bit more than just literacy. You also have to be able to understand the content. You just told us during the pandemic that was not always easy. Another step was also not easy all the time. And you can see from our numbers that it's also difficult to judge about health information. And then finally also to apply it to one's own behavioral and to analysis of one's own health status. We assume that this health literacy, especially in modern and complex society, is incredibly important. And even though that does not include pandemic yet, I want to say something about that, because in the modern society, the requirements for health questions have risen enormously, and just being able to read is not enough anymore. You really have to um, work yourself through all these complex requirements. You have to be able to cope with all that information, and therefore you need health literacy, or you may also call it competence. That is even more important in an unexpected situation of crisis. There, it's not only important for life, but it's really life important for survival to handle health information. And I think that's something we all experienced in our own lives. And it's not easy. And you mentioned already that it takes also sufficient information from the onset. And we have to be able to find the right information for oneself. And then this information also um, have to have the right quality and have to be safe. They have to be useful, not just related or reduced to simple facts, so that it's applicable. Those are some of the requirements. And you also mentioned another one, that is how to find information is not such an easy task as one might think. And there we due to the increase of information, due to digitization, in the meantime, we have to deal with a really overwhelming flood of information, where we have to try to find the suitable information and appropriate information. And it has become even more difficult, because we have to deal with a mix of serious and non-serious information, which has been spread during the pandemic. And so people are already calling it an infodemic, as you already highlighted. As we can see from our numbers, health literacy in Germany is not at its best in Germany. In our studies, which we repeatedly carried out at international level, we'll come back to that in a minute, because I would also come up with a little comparison. But let me come up with the German data first. So it's not well developed. More than half of the population has a very low level of literacy, health literacy. So they are not able to read and understand health information and to judge about it, and even less to apply it, especially application of information is a difficult task for Germans. And we also could see that health literacy in Germany has worsened over the years. From a level of 54%, it went down to the very low level of 60%. And that was the case already before the pandemic. Those data had been collected before the pandemic. And I think those are really data which make us be concerned. And when we look, for instance, to the north of Europe, our Norwegian colleague also took part in our studies together with Germany participated as well. And that in that study, Germany is at the end of the 17 uh, participating countries, whereas Norway is rather in the middle. And we may discuss the reasons in a minute, but let me say something different before, which may be important for this discussion because we are talking about ways of information. We could see in the studies at international level that there is always the same level, that health literacy is distributed unequally among different layers of society. And that means that people with a low level of education or social status are more affected. Elderly people, partly people with a migration background, especially when they had their own migration experience. That's very important in this analysis. And people with several chronic diseases are also affected, not just in general those groups, but multimorbid and migration people. But those are exactly those people who depend even more on health information. And it's exactly that part of the population who depend much more on this information during the pandemic. So when looking at the way of communication, we assumed that especially for those groups, a special communication strategy would be required. We need a communication strategy in general in order to improve health literacy in Germany. There is no question about that. As some parts have already been done also from our own side, but the so-called vulnerable groups, of course, need more promotion strategies. And there was a lack in that until today, from my point of view. For instance, when we look at the communication politics in the field of health. So this is really a part which is not well developed. And there is something which we have been knowing for a time. You need communication with regard to certain target groups and strategies which take into account the special situations of certain target groups, which are not abstract knowledge, but which take into account the way people are living and how they deal with their environment. On top of that, we need also mm, strategies which approach those people, especially I'm referring to people who really go out into the field and do not just wait for the information to be collected, but will really take the information down to the groups. Those are very important points for today's discussion. In Germany, we have some individual examples, especially how we managed during the COVID pandemic um, to come up with some good approaches, but in total, there is a deficit in Germany which needs to be tackled urgently because we all know that after the pandemic, we are already approaching the next health crisis, and we should rather learn from the past pandemic because there is such a deficit, as I mentioned. Let me just add something, but may I do so now or shall I wait for later? Because we collected some additional data on COVID and we had some rather surprising results. Shall I do so? So if you announce it as something surprising, I think we can't wait for it longer. And I'm terribly interested in that. So please go ahead. Yes, because we did this study before the COVID pandemic. Most of the countries who took part in the international survey continued to do so during the pandemic. And we added another survey during the pandemic, 6 weeks after the pandemic had started. And lo and behold, in these 6 months, health literacy had really improved. The portion of lower level of health literacy went down by 5%. And in the digital health literacy, it went down even more, and especially for people with a low level of education. That's really a remarkable finding, because on the one hand, we always had been complaining for lack of communication or lack of reasonable communication strategies. But in the meantime, we have to cope with a more desperate situation. On the one hand, this is true. On the other hand, we also have to admit that never before there had been so much information on health issues like during those years. And never before people had been even forced to deal with health care issues like during the pandemic. So I would like to say that there was a lot of information around, and the pressure to cope with this information was really helpful. That's a thesis, of course, which needs to be revised and checked, but I think we could carefully come up with that thesis. And for communication, this is of extreme importance from my point of view, because when we called for the end of the pandemic, we actually stopped also providing any kind of information on the subject. And also in general, the portion of health communication went down tremendously. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Schaeffer. I think that is a very good moment for inviting Ms. Greiner, Ms. Wangare Greiner. You mentioned that people with a migration background and other groups have a rather low level of health literacy. Ms. Greiner, maybe we can ask you, do you feel that people with a migration background are generally good informed in Germany when it comes to health care issues? Or if this is not the case, what are the special needs and how could we change the situation? Well, I think that in the course of our work, which you have been doing for more than 22 years for health care for migrants, we found out that the how disadvantaged certain groups are. And during the COVID pandemic, we could see that indeed it was the case. We were the last in the line who received vaccinations. Access was really complicated. Information was unilateral. Everything was only written in German or in many European languages, but not in the languages of our clients. And not all of them were really included. We also have some target groups such as asylum seekers who were denied asylum, people who were not insured. And it was a challenge to many of them because without our activity, if we hadn't been active and told them that there is a project, because we found out there was really a major group of people who doesn't have access to healthcare, and they don't even have access to work, because without vaccination it meant that they couldn't work, and it also meant that they didn't have a job. So, and that is why we confronted several institutions with that situations, and we also got a project from the health ministry for people with an with African roots, and people really we developed some information materials which people really could understand. And that is also how we understood that, for instance, in Africa, Africa was a very complicated continent, because due to the different languages we speak there, which is quite a lot of different languages, and people really were in need for information in their mother tongues. And so we developed a lot of materials with images and also with different languages. And finally, we could also mobilize people so that in our institutions, we could also offer vaccination with the help of cooperation of the health office, which also provided us with doctors. And we as a community ourselves were not prepared for such a situation that we really would be effective to that level. Also, in a way, we weren't even aware that we were a vulnerable group in this sense. So we should try to offer a collective offer not just for single groups. I remember that we confronted different doctors with the situation, and they told us if vaccination will come up, we would be the last group to receive it because we were not organized at the time. Okay, is that mainly a language barrier as you described it, or are there other needs? There is a language barrier indeed, but it is also due to the health system. It is not only about health literacy here, it's also that they are disadvantaged by the language barrier. They do not know about the possibilities for healthcare, and they also have a different understanding of health in their culture. Health has its own language, and the doctors here also have their own language, and we also come up with our own understanding of what health really means, what we expect from a doctor. It's a totally different attitude than the normal German one. Mr. Ihlen, I would like to invite you now to join our discussion. So you mainly look at Norwegian or Nordic countries. What is your take on the communication during the COVID pandemic in the north of Europe? We heard already that there is more health literacy in your country. So what was the communication like? Was it different than in other countries?
Well, vielen Dank, and thanks for having me. My research has mainly targeted the Scandinavian public health authorities. That is, we've researched how the Scandinavian public health authorities have communicated to build trust during COVID-19. In the Scandinavian countries, as you may or may not know, we've been quite lucky in the sense that the mortality rates have been relatively low. And we have a high trust context. So there was a high trust in the public health institutions at the very outset. And also during the pandemic and after the pandemic, the levels of trust have been remarkably high. Now, what we've done, we've tried to isolate or try to pinpoint how this can be explained. And obviously, the low mortality rates themselves speaks volumes about the success of the strategy. That is the way that this has been handled. So that would be one aspect, the low mortality rates. The second aspect is obviously the initial high trusts in the public health authorities. And also, I should add, the Scandinavian countries and Norway in particular, we are quite fortunate in the sense that people live relatively far apart from each other. So that puts us on an advantage, or that gives us an advantage when a pandemic hits and it's you should get isolated, for instance. So there are lots of factors that we would pinpoint, trying to explain how the high levels of trust came about in a Nordic setting. What we've also done, talking about communication, we've looked into different principles that were established or were used by the public health authorities. And one of these principles that we have addressed is this notion of transparency. That is transparency, not only in the sense that you should provide the citizens with tons of data, that is, you shouldn't dump tons of data in the lap of citizens and expect them to sort it out. Because as Dr. Schaeffer remarked, there are different levels of health literacy. So transparency, if you like, transparency 2.0 would mean that you should provide information that is understandable, that is perceived to be complete, information consubstantiality, I think it's called. That is one dimension of transparency that is important. But the other dimension of transparency that we have pointed to is also accountability. That is, you should be transparent when you make mistakes, for instance. And the third dimension that I would like to highlight is the dimension of participation. That is, citizens should be given a say, citizens should be able to voice their opinions. And like Dr. Greiner or Mrs. Greiner remarked, there are different needs that people have. Different needs, different perspectives, and you should, as a citizen, be able to submit this to let the authorities know about this. That would mean be meaningful transparency in this sense. I'll stop there.
Mhm. Vielen Dank Ihnen.
Oh, thank you very much. Mr. Backhaus, Mr. Ihlen mentioned the notion of trust and transparency. On Twitter, you also checked some data and studies, and a lot of misinformation was there around. And what struck you when you did your research?
So I would make a pretty strong differentiation between intentional misinformation and, let's say, innocent misinformation, by which I mean people just making mistakes, for example, or people asking honest questions about things which maybe they do not fully understand yet, and they try to find an answer which might not be correct. For example, many people formed opinions, let's say in Germany, saying we should adopt the Scandinavian approach to the pandemic. And Professor Ihlen just mentioned a number of really good arguments why that's not so easy to accept this argument. For example, because Scandinavian societies have much higher interpersonal trust, they have much higher trust towards the public health authorities, and they have a better state of health overall than Germany, for example. And they have lower population density, which might also be a factor. So I thought what I occasionally did was pointing out basically, okay, there's a fallacy in the interpretation of the data we might be seeing from Scandinavia, which was looking better most of the time. And to draw the conclusion from that we can basically do the same is a bit foregone for a number of scientifically valid reasons, I believe. And then, of course, there still is lots of intentional misinformation with people just lying and making things up and being non-responsive to being pointed to that their analysis is not correct.
Mhm. Jetzt in dem Zusammenhang frage ich mich,
in this context, I would like to ask, what is the role of media in this way of communication, and what should media do in such a situation? Maybe that's a question to you, Mr. Ihlen, but also to the other experts.
Well, scholars that have looked into the role of media have noticed that this is what is called rally around the flag effect. That is, the media and the citizens tend to close ranks together with the public health authorities and the authorities in general when a crisis hit. Eventually, this consensus on the way that the crisis is handled crumbles. That is, critical journalistic investigative pieces prop up. The population or citizens grow tired of how the crisis is handled, for instance. So eventually this consensus evaporates and more critical questions come to the fore. At least that was the situation in the Norwegian context and the Nordic context, I would say. Even in Sweden, the Swedes, as we know, chose a different path than most other countries. They decided against strong measures to stop the pandemic. They kept their borders open and no lockdowns were introduced, at least initially. And even in Sweden, when they chose this different path, even Swedes closed ranks and supported this decision by the government. And I think that this, again, rally around the flag effect has been noticed in quite a few studies elsewhere as well. Now, obviously, the second part here is that the media, we expect the journalists to be critical towards, say, decisions that affect the vulnerable part of the population. And journalists in Norway, for instance, did recognize that, yes, at the outset of the pandemic, we ignored or we weren't sufficiently attentive to the needs of, say, migrant groups, for instance. So that in hindsight, Norwegian journalists have been quite self-critical. They have said that we should have done a better job. We should have done a better job to question why schools were closed down when the youth and the teenagers weren't really part of the problem in the first place.
Mhm. Sie haben jetzt schon die besondere Rolle Schwedens
You have already addressed the special role of Sweden. Nevertheless, when we take a look at the Scandinavian countries, they're usually summarized, and one has said there is one Scandinavian model. Is that indeed the case, do you think, or are there big differences?
This is actually something that I'm writing a call for papers on together with colleagues from the Nordic countries. We're putting together a call for papers addressing this very issue. Is this myth of the Nordic exceptionalism, is this really a thing? How different is the Norwegian society or the Nordic societies? What can be said, though, is that there has been this tradition of this tripartite cooperation between employers, employees, and the government. And this close cooperation has historic roots that has led to very low levels of conflict in the Nordic society. So that is one aspect that is mentioned frequently. That model or that aspect of that model is constantly threatened, and you could see attempts to dismantle this arrangement in some countries. But that is, of course, a very political perspective and a political viewpoint that different people will disagree on. But in total, in general, I would say that yes, there is this notion of a Nordic model, but and it has certain characteristics. Egalitarianism is definitely up there as one aspect or one dimension, but it's very different in the Nordic countries in that regard, whereas Swedes have their nobility. There are no nobility in Norway, for instance. So as a Scandinavian or as a Nordic citizen, we tend to, if not get offended when people lump us together. I would say there are similarities and there are differences.
Mhm. Frau Schaeffer, Sie haben ja
Mrs. Schaeffer, a while ago you said that Norway, and I'm not sure, perhaps that also applies to all Scandinavian countries, performs particularly well when it comes to health literacy. Perhaps you could say something more on that. And then there's also a question from the audience, namely why the health literacy in Germany has reduced. Because one should think that it has increased with the emergence of the internet. So please respond to these two aspects. Thank you. Yes, I'm certainly pleased to do that. Now, to start with the last aspect, health. Why is health literacy worse than it used to be? Of course, we were quite irritated by that, and we had that very much on our minds. But if we take a look at since when we have been dealing with this topic in Germany, this hasn't been such a long time. Internationally, specifically in the US, there has been a very long research tradition, also promotional strategies. But in Germany, you have only been looking into this topic for 10 years. And the first study, that is, let alone EU study in Germany, only participated with one German state. The first studies on the situation in Germany came out in 2015, 2016, and there the discussion started. The next study I refer to regarding this worsening came out in 2020. So this is a relatively short space of time in which something could have been done, and not as much has happened as we would have liked to see. Of course, we have a national action plan, which contains many recommendations. We have the Alliance for Health Literacy of the Federal Ministry, but it takes some time usually until findings can seep down and arrive at state government level, and especially also in the local governments. So we see that much more is happening today than it used to be the case. We have to take this into account. However, we're always saying worsening does not mean that the population has become more stupid. Rather, the circumstances have become more complicated. Infodemic is a topic I want to talk about another bit, and what is going on in the media in very general terms, though. But I do think we need to differentiate in this field too. I'm here talking especially about the digital media. This is just very much of a confusion. It is very difficult to look through all that. In Germany, there have been efforts to intervene. The Federal Ministry of Health had planned to set up a portal where quality assured data are posted which population can find on health and sickness. One started predominantly with sickness data. There are other portals which can also be called secure and reliable in terms of the information, but let me stick to that portal of the federal government. This had to be retracted for several reasons. Among other things, the ministry cooperated with Google and some parties sued them for that. This is important to know because this action in Germany showed that health information has become a commodity. So we are in a hotly contested market here. And this is a situation we beforehand may not have had. I'm not quite sure about that, but definitely it has become more pointed. And the population, of course, is not aware of that. And that we are in a market is demonstrated alone by the fact that we receive a lot of information which is littered with advertisements, so that especially elder people don't know where does the ad end and where is what I'm looking for. So the circumstances, in summary, have just become more complicated. And the consequence was that the health literacy, from our perspective, has worsened. And in addition, our homework here has not yet done well. But politically, the story has been shelved, also even before the pandemic. The readiness to look into this topic was not very high. It was very high when at that time we prepared the study, and the then health minister had adopted and owned up to this topic. Mr. Gröhe, who is also involved in the demography days a lot, also adopted that topic. The following health ministers didn't. And this is another problem. So we don't get any continuous thematic careers into place, but there is a political change in government, and then the attention is drawn to other topics, and this is reflected here. Can you tell me what the first part of the question was about Norway? Why was it that the countries performed better, right? Yes, why they performed better, and perhaps also how health literacy could be increased. What is Norway better at? Well, this is my colleague from Norway, actually, who should say that. Let me put forward a proposition he might want to refer to and express his stance. I think in the Scandinavian states, the cooperation between research and policymaking in this field is closer than in Germany. We also see this in the international study in which we participate. There, we usually have a scientific representative and a policy representative, and we see that Norway is in an excellent position there. And I could imagine that the findings are fed into the policymaking field more directly, that is, that the cooperation is just much more close, and that this could have an effect, besides the aspect that had already been mentioned, just that there is greater trust in public health institutions. And we have to be clear about that. Our public health institutions are on the reform agenda now, but even before the pandemic, they were weak, very weak. And during the pandemic, we openly saw that crisis. So the trust in these institutions was not high. And this also plays a role, of course. And transparency is another big challenge we have in Germany, which currently is also on the reform agenda. So with these points, I'll stop here, and I believe we would have to look to Norway directly and ask our colleague. Mr. Ihlen, you had already raised your hand to take the floor. I don't know whether this was on that point, but please feel free to refer to what Mrs. Schaeffer just said.
Thank you. Well, yes, in regards to health literacy, I can only speculate because this is not my field. What I have noticed, though, is that, like it was mentioned, the close cooperation between the public health authorities, the researchers in this area, and the government, that is a crucial factor here. Coupled together with, I'd say, the high trust, as was mentioned, and also in the case of the COVID-19, I would say that the Norwegian media did a fabulous job in explaining science. They also had access to excellent communicators, trusted communicators that were able to explain the science and the consequences of COVID-19 and the root causes and so forth in intelligible manners to the Nordic public or Norwegian public. So that would, I would say, or I would guess, it would go some part or some way to explain high levels of health literacy. But I did raise my hand because this notion of infodemic was mentioned. And I'm really curious to hear the panelists' views on this. Because as COVID-19 approached, or as the COVID-19 pandemic carried on, we were all bracing ourselves, at least in Norway, for this infodemic to arrive. We didn't see it. We didn't see it, and research that I've read has also put this notion or interrogated this notion and asked, is this really a myth? Is this something that did happen? And I'm talking now about international research that I've read, but I'm really eager, this is not a rhetorical question, I'm really eager to hear whether or not this notion still carries some weight in, say, Germany and other places.
Herr Backhaus, Sie melden sich.
Mr. Backhaus, you raised your hand.
On the role of the media, I just wanted to add, in Germany, I think this cooperation that has been described for the Norwegian case has been working out fairly poorly. I mean, obviously we had some good podcasts spreading good information, but on the other hand, almost every week it happened that some random paper, preprint, not peer-reviewed, or just sometimes a statement got picked up by a news agency and went over the ticker and had already reached millions of readers before any fact checker could respond to it. And this has happened nearly every week. And it was very frustrating and tiring because it would have been fairly easy for these agencies to contact an expert or several experts before to collect their opinions. And often they haven't done this because everyone just knew we need to be the first one to put out this ticker news. Then we will get the clicks and we will get the revenue. So why waste time with the fact checking? Yeah, that was what I wanted to add to the world of the media. And regarding the infodemic, I mean, it's hard to think back, but I think in the early days of the pandemic in Germany, there was this hunger for information, and our public health agencies were keeping information quite constrained, I would say. It took them a long time to start weekly press conferences where people could ask questions. Also, the data they shared was quite limited in the beginning. It's still limited in some sense. And that's, I think, pushed some people to seek alternative sources of information and data. So it's like it's a two-sided sword, right? You can definitely provide too much information that people cannot digest mentally, but you can also provide too little and thereby give a reason for people to seek less reliable sources.
Frau Greiner, Sie melden sich.
Ms. Greiner, you raised your hand.
I think that for us was the social media. It plays a very major role. We saw that the African communities went on social media from African countries where they come from, and there were a lot of misinformation, which we had, in fact, to go through before they could even give us trust of what we are telling them, because they already had collected information from different different social media groups. And we came up with a booklet, The Myths of COVID-19 in African Communities. We collected them. And in fact, we found it was very interesting on how people started creating their own beliefs and also recipes on COVID-19. And we were very interested to see, and also at the same time to understand. So, and also to understand in order to come with our own German strategy for the African community. It wouldn't have been possible if we didn't first start giving them space to talk and also to tell us what is it that they have against vaccination and what information do they have. I think we need really to take into account the Ist-Zustand or their position before we come up with our ideas on offering them something. Because if it is a counterproductive if we do that.
Frau Schaeffer.
Ja, ich würde allem Gesagten zustimmen. Also zum Thema nochmal Menschen.
Ms. Schaeffer, well, I would consent to everything that was said. People with a migration background, the major things about that have been said. We had no information tailored to their situation, and we cannot talk about one group of migrants. We have heard it in Germany. There are many, many different groups of migrants living, and we would have needed targeted strategies for them, sure. And first of all, we should have developed an understanding, comprehension for them. You said that. And we could have learned from them too, especially in the field of the assistance strategies for people with migration background. We saw that these people digitally are much fitter than the German population. Our figures show that. We have a specific study on that at hand, and the figures show that. But they also showed what can be done with these channels. So they are much more active on very other channels, also to mutually inform each other. This is something I think we would have to use much more actively. However, I would like to say something generally on this proposition. We may have had too little and too much information. I would like to underscore this. We had too much information, and at the same time, with a view to this little additional data collection exercise, we had too little information. By all means, we had too little bona fide and quality assured information and too much chaotic information. I just call it this name. Also, manipulated information. Let's just think about vaccination and wearing face masks. The existence of COVID-19. There was targeted manipulation of information, especially on the digital media. Such information was disseminated. And in Germany, this had it that we are on a way to a split. We are now discussing it on the example of the German Populist Party AfD. We, the National Action Plan, warned of that. We could see the development that such a split, a chasm in the population was emergent. And I think this is a central difference to the Scandinavian countries. My son lives in Copenhagen, and he is really surprised at what we are doing here in the field of digital media. He said it's very easy in this country. The information comes to me. I have it all the time. I can easily operate it. So he can. It seems to be the case in Norway and the Nordics, probably also in Norway, that through digitization, a lot happened in the field of information. Also, many user-friendly things happened. And here, the user-friendliness is missing in Germany. I think this is our central problem. And I don't see a lot of motion in this sense. And there's also a lack of communication. Let me give you a recent example. In our study, many people, I would need to look that up. I think 74% find it difficult to handle information about legislative reform. But take a look in Germany at how legislative reforms are developed and communicated. They are hardly communicated. We have now rolled out EPA, or this is intended, other laws too. We don't have communication and information about that, and this is a general problem. We, for example, think, okay, let's legislate, and that's it. But this is not what is sufficient. In this modern world, it's no longer sufficient to prepare a study. Now I'm talking about the science side, and we hope for the results to be distributed. No, we have to communicate them. And this societal change, I believe, has not yet arrived in the minds of the people in many fields. And what would be a solution, would you say? You said on the one hand, there's too much information that is perhaps overwhelming. Then there's also too little information that is perhaps comprehensible and could be played out through digital channels. And I believe you also said a while ago that before the pandemic is after the pandemic, that is the next crisis may be around the corner. So what would you wish to see for a future pandemic or crisis? And how should the policymakers, science, media, and society work together and communicate to each other? Question to all of you. If I may add something, we on the National Action Plan also had a media workshop where we mainly contacted with print media. And I think it was not very fortunate because exactly this self-image of the media is not there in Germany, like you said it, namely that media explain things, explain findings, scientific outcomes. I think it's now taking hold more and more. And I do think we also are getting more science reporting. That is, the articles from science journalists are increasing in number, but we don't have it at that level. And in this workshop, we had to learn that the media told us, well, we see ourselves as a critical instance, and we are not an instance that whose task it is to teach the people something. So this is a different self-image where I believe we have to much more go into a discourse and rethink in modern societies. Is that right? I mean, of course, we do need critical instances, but I think we have to have a broader discourse in order to help this topic of information and communication gain importance, especially in health. And so to say, not pursue topics which are hip and in, and then to stop the discourse again, and then reporting education campaigns to be stopped and then move on to the next topic. I believe this is with a view to the recipients. This is not meaningful. Rather, we know that people take some time to absorb things and process them, and that repetition is important to do that. It's a different topic, but, well, one would have to more intensely discuss that. So this means you see more responsibility on the side of the media than on the side of the policymakers? No, not at all. The policymakers, so to say, turned away from this topic in a way, and I think this is a very, very tricky development. Of course, the importance of health communication and information must be introduced to policymaking much more. The politicians themselves must communicate more about what they do, rather than just saying, I have a visitor here whose name is so-and-so, but what they do has to be communicated and explained to the population. They need to attach greater importance to the topic. We are in a reform discussion in Germany at the moment around the change of the former Central Office for Health Education at the federal level. Let's see what the outcome will be, but the importance must grow in Germany. Otherwise, in the next pandemic, we will be in the same dilemma or in the next crisis. Yeah, hopefully it's not a pandemic again. I've got two more people who want to speak. Mr. Ihlen, you raised your hand first.
Yes, please. Speaking about transparency and also health literacy, I mean, there are very practical ways of dealing with information offered by digital platforms. Say, if health literacy on the one end is low, you need basic answers for your questions. If your health literacy is very high, on the other hand, you are interested in very detailed reports and so forth. And obviously, this can be structured and offered to the public in a way that allows you to go through different levels dig deep if that is what you need, stay on top if that's what you prefer. So again, it's about transparency and information consumptionality. This is a tongue twister, sorry. It's about offering people information that they can understand. It's about offering people information they need. It's about offering people information that they ask for.
Spannender Ansatz. Gibt es das denn in
Very
Norwegen?
exciting starting point. Do you have that in Norway, that the same information is available at different levels or in different ways?
Yes, that is what the public health authorities have tried to offer. But I think they need to structure this or build this infrastructure, strengthen this infrastructure in the face of future pandemics and other health crises.
Herr Backhaus, Sie melden sich auch.
Mr. Backhaus, you also raised your hand.
I just wanted to add what Professor Schaeffer said, that there has been this attitude during the pandemic, basically that the politicians said we will leave the explaining to the scientists, which has been working out less and less successfully over the pandemic, mostly because scientists' jobs are really to explain, for example, okay, what is happening to the virus, how is it mutating, how does the vaccines work, and so on, so on. But they were always pressed into the situation of having to explain, why do we need this political measure now? Why does the government need to do this or that? Because these were very unpleasant things to explain and to justify. And this has been pushed to the scientists, who picked it up unwillingly, I believe. And I think after their experiences of many scientists during COVID, they will not do it again. So there's definitely a need for a replacement for them.
Verstehe. Und es gibt ja schon auch in der Bevölkerung
I
so das
see, and also in the population, there is obviously a need to understand and be able to understand the policymakers' decision and also understand the studies and data used as a basis. Would you say it is important that every person understands statistics?
I wouldn't say so, because the important decisions, the most important ones, well, some of them at least, were ones where you didn't have a study to justify it, or you didn't have a statistic really to justify it. In the end, it was a risk assessment between different outcomes, which both had potential costs and benefits. And in this, I see the role basically of the politicians to make this assessment and to explain their reasoning to the public. And this is something that scientists, I think, cannot do, because we do not have, scientists in general do not have the legitimacy to do so, and sometimes also not the skills maybe to explain something as simple as good politicians can explain an issue. And really, it's not their job in the end.
Herr Ihlen,
I see. Mr. Ihlen, you want to say something, please?
Yes, I totally agree. And I also want to add that we saw this very interesting situation, at least in Norway, where people were asking for directions, asking the public health authorities, what should we do? Whereas in most of the literature, you will find incentives or people pointing to the need to discuss and democratize this whole process. So the picture that we often, or the metaphor that we often use, is that sometimes you find yourself in a foreign city and you want to find a way to the train station, and you ask somebody on the street, where is the train station? And then you want them to point you in the right direction. Don't necessarily want to discuss the statistics of the train schedule or what is a train or whatever. You need directions. And some people, at least some segments of the population, would like directions, would like tell us what to do to tackle this pandemic. Whereas others, of course, would like to engage in a more informed discussion about, is this the right thing to do? Are there other options, and so forth and so on. So paying close attention to the needs, again, of the audience is key, I believe.
Vielen Dank. Ja, ich schaue auf die Uhr. Ich
Thank you very much. Looking at the clock, you know, I was terrified to see how late it is. So thank you very much for this discussion. I think we could have spent much more time discussing this. However, the next panel is already waiting and the next experts are on the starting line. This panel will be followed by a panel on adaptation to climate change. So please do stay online or use the same link to log in once more if you want to listen to that panel too. So many thanks to you, to all panelists for this discussion, for the expertise you contributed. I found it was a very exciting panel, and thanks also very much to everyone who listened. And have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Tschüss.
Tschüss.